All right, so there we are. Joe,
Okay.
I'm gonna sneak. Yeah. And please, the floor is all yours.
So I wonder if there's a way I can see the whole of the slide. That might be useful to me.
To move the video there is, yeah, that.
Okay, very good. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for that introduction and for accommodating me for this talk today. It's always a pleasure to be back here at the UQ Philosophy Department and see some old friends again. And I was just saying to Marty at the start that it seems like yesterday, but is in fact almost 25 years since I was an honours student here in the philosophy department, which was the time when I made the decision to go into academia. So the UQ philosophy department was very formative for me in my career and in my life. So as I mentioned before, as part of the introduction, I work mostly in legal philosophy and normative ethics, but today I'm branching out a little bit. So my topic is existential reasons for choosing to believe. And I'll have a little bit to say relevant to legal philosophy at the end, but mostly I'll be branching out into some other areas. So it's a typical philosophy paper in the sense that I'm going to start with some definitions, then I'll give you a plan for the talk. I'll spend a bit of time setting up the basic reasons for my thesis. I'll consider a few possible objections, and then I'll get to some implications of what I'm saying at the end. So the topic today in general is doxastic voluntarism. And there are two main forms of doxastic voluntarism, which I've defined on this first slide, and one is far more contentious than the other. So the first is indirect doxastic voluntarism, which is the view that people have indirect voluntary control over their beliefs, in the sense that they can cause themselves to hold a particular belief by performing some series of intermediate actions. And pretty much everybody accepts that indirect doxastic voluntarism is true. So it is possible for people to exercise this sort of indirect control over their beliefs. How do they do that? Well, there's probably two main ways. You can cause yourself to have a particular belief indirectly by bringing about some state of affairs. So I can cause myself to believe that my office door is shut by getting up and closing the door. Or you can give yourself a belief indirectly by doing some research and finding out further information. So I can cause myself to believe that Julian Lamont is a philosopher at UQ by looking him up online and finding his web profile. So indirect doxastic voluntarism appears fairly unproblematic. So my main topic for today is direct doxastic voluntarism. Now, this is the view that people have or can have direct voluntary control over their beliefs, in the sense that they can cause themselves to believe something immediately just by choosing to do so. And as I foreshadowed before, this view is far more contentious in the philosophical literature. I think it's fair to say that philosophical opinion is strongly against DDV, as I'll be calling it, although it has a few defenders, and we'll encounter one or two of those later in the talk. And particularly influential arguments against DDV have been offered by Bernard Williams and William Alston. And so I take that these are the most influential objections to the view, and I'll consider them more closely a bit later on. So that's the definitions that we need to start with. Now, what I want to do in this paper is to offer what I'm calling a modest defence of DDV, by focusing in particular on the role in belief formation of what I call existential reasons. And those are reasons a person has to adopt certain actions or attitudes because they wish to be a particular kind of person. And so my argument is that there are some cases, at least, where people choose to adopt a belief because they wish to be the kind of person who would hold that belief or the kind of belief that it belongs to. And if I succeed in establishing that thesis, I'm calling it a modest defense of DDV because I've shown that direct doxastic voluntarism is true. It's possible to directly cause yourself to hold certain beliefs, at least in this type of situation that I'm talking about. That is where you have an existential reason to do that. So the outline of the argument is in basically 3 parts. So I'm going to start by motivating the argument by giving 2 examples of cases where I think it's plausible that in that scenario, beliefs have been chosen by the person for existential reasons. Then I'll consider the influential objections to DDV outlined by Williams and Alston, and I'll argue that existential belief choices, at least in the types of cases I've outlined, avoid those objections. And then the final part of the paper will reflect on the relevance of this idea of existential reasons for belief for 2 particular belief categories. The first one is legal obligation, so that's where my background in legal philosophy comes in. And the second one is beliefs about God. So that's what I plan to do. And so we'll start with the motivational part of the argument and 2 cases. So the first case is one that I'm calling generous colleague. And so here's the scenario. Abinash is the dean of a law school, and the law school maintains a library of reference works in its common room for faculty to use. And then one of the most expensive and widely used reference works goes missing, and there's speculation around the corridors that a faculty member has appropriated it for their personal library. And I hasten to add that this is not based on any actual example. This is purely hypothetical. But there's no proof that this is what has happened. So it's also possible that someone just accidentally mislaid the book, and that's why it can't be found. And Abinash could look into it. He's a very busy man, but he could look into this further. He could, for example, go around and look into all the faculty offices to see if someone has the book on their shelves. But he chooses to believe that the book was lost rather than stolen. Now, why does he do that? He does it because he wants to be a charitable and generous colleague. He wants to be the type of person who thinks well of others, and he prefers to believe that his colleagues would not steal the book unless he's presented with clear evidence to the contrary. So I say this is an example where Abinash wants to be a particular type of person who has an existential reason, and for that reason he chooses to believe that the book hasn't been stolen. And I think this is a psychologically plausible and also a rational thing for him to do. So that's the first case. And the second case, which is broadly of a similar kind, is what I call the case of a supportive mentor. So Ying is a senior academic and she's supervising James, who is a doctoral student. And James has chosen to undertake his studies in a highly competitive field where very few jobs are available at the end of his degree. And he's a good student. He's hardworking, he's talented, but he has a hard road ahead of him because the discipline is so competitive. And James understands the difficulties of his chosen path, but he's determined to pursue it. And Ying, for her part, is aware of James's good qualities and also the challenges he faces. But she decides to believe that James will succeed rather than fail. Why does she do that? She does it because she wants to be the type of person who believes in her protege. She wants, in other words, to be a supportive mentor, and she prefers to believe that James will be successful unless the evidence compels her to think otherwise. So if after a long period of time, James doesn't succeed in getting a job, she's not going to indefinitely hold on to this belief in the face of the evidence. But at the start of his efforts, when the evidence is somewhat balanced, she chooses to believe that he's going to succeed. Okay, so those are the 2 cases. Let me unpack a bit more what I want to say about them. So both of these examples involve a person, let's call them S, who chooses to believe in a proposition P because they prefer or desire to be a particular kind of person. And this is what I call in this paper an existential reason. It's important that both cases involve evidential uncertainty. So it's not clear, based on the information available, whether S epistemically should believe P or not P. And so I suggest the existential reason that they have appears to tip the balance in favour of P. That is, it gives S a non-evidential reason to believe that P. And just to reiterate, it's crucial that in both cases the evidence is somewhat evenly balanced. So Abinash prefers not to believe that his colleagues are thieves. If confronted with evidence of theft, he would be surprised and dismayed, but he would adapt his beliefs accordingly. So he's not a dupe, but until he's confronted with contrary evidence, he prefers to hold a particular belief. And as I mentioned before, Ying similarly prefers to believe that James will succeed, but she wouldn't cling to this belief indefinitely in the face of his repeated failure. Okay, so those are the two cases. Now, what I'm going to do next is say a little bit about some of the main objections in the literature to DDV and the extent to which they might cause problems for what I'm proposing. So we've got two arguments from Bernard Williams and then one argument from Alston. So here's the first argument from Williams, and I've set it out in full, partly because with both of Williams' arguments, there's a little bit of unpacking to do, and it's not entirely clear what the argument is, or what the central reason is that he's relying on. So Williams says in this passage, one reason is connected with the characteristic of beliefs that they aim at truth. If I could acquire a belief at will, I could acquire it whether it was true or not. Moreover, I would know that I could acquire it whether it was true or not. If in full consciousness I could will to acquire a belief, irrespective of its truth, it is unclear that before the event, I could seriously think of it as a belief, that is, as something purporting to represent reality. At the very least, there must be a restriction on what is the case after the event. Since I could not then, in full consciousness, regard this as a belief of mine, that is, something I take to be true, and also know that I acquired it at will. So essentially what Williams is suggesting, I think, is that it's psychologically implausible that someone could voluntarily cause themselves to hold a particular belief. If we were in that situation, we wouldn't in fact be able to regard that belief as a true belief in the sense that, as he puts it, it aims at truth. So Williams says, in essence, it's not possible to acquire a belief, irrespective of whether it is true or not. That is to say, you can't acquire a belief knowing that you don't have epistemic reason to believe that it's true or not, while knowing that I obtained the belief under those conditions. So Carl Genet, in some useful work which is unpacking what Williams is saying here, suggests two possible ways of formulating the crux of the argument. So firstly, he suggests that Williams holds that one cannot come to believe something while lacking any desire that one's belief be true. So you can't be indifferent to whether your belief is true and with that attitude, succeed in forming a genuine belief. However, in relation to the cases that I've been discussing, Abinash and Ying are both very far from lacking a desire that their beliefs be true. In fact, they would both very much prefer that their beliefs be true. Moreover, if they were confronted with evidence that their beliefs are false, they would abandon their beliefs rather than ignore the evidence. So this seems to suggest, I think, that their state of mind is consistent with holding the desire that their beliefs be true. So I don't see that this interpretation of Williams' argument poses any trouble. But Genet also suggests a different or alternative way of understanding what Williams is getting at. So this is the idea that one cannot believe that P unless one's counting on P is motivated by a desire to have true beliefs. So the idea is that you have to have a particular sort of motivation in order to arrive at a genuine belief. You have to be motivated by your desire that the belief be true. And Genet's response to this is to doubt that this claim captures either a conceptual or psychological truth about belief. So basically he contends, and I think this is correct, that not all reasons for belief need to be evidential or epistemic ones. So to see why he says that, or why I think that's a plausible claim, apart from the cases I'm discussing, I'm going to spend a little bit of time unpacking Genet's defence of DDV. So he gives a number of examples in this paper, which he thinks are plausible cases of directly chosen beliefs. So this one I think is particularly useful, and it's broadly representative of the type of scenario that he's examining. So he says, we have started on a trip by car, and 50 miles from home, my wife asks me, did I lock the front door? And I think about it, and I seem to remember that I did, but I don't have a clear, detailed, confident impression of locking that door. But given the great inconvenience of turning back to make sure, and the undesirability of worrying about it for the whole trip, I decide to continue on and believe that I did lock it. So this is a common scenario. We've all been in a scenario like this from time to time. And Genet says not only is it common, but it's plausible to describe this by saying that this is a genuine case where I choose to believe a particular proposition. So he finds it credible, and I agree, that such cases involve genuine beliefs. And here's how he explains it. He says, coming to believe that P, by deciding to do so, seems more psychologically possible and less irrational when the subject has some non-conclusive evidence that P, and also has significant reason for wanting it to be the case that P. So he's, in that passage, trying to describe the sort of case where DDV is plausible. It's not a case where you have strong evidence against what you're trying to believe. It's a case where you have some evidence that P is in fact true, but there might be other contrary evidence, so the evidence is equivocal. And then in addition to that, you also have some significant reason for wanting it to be the case that P. In that sense, you have reason to stake something on it being the case that P, but that reason need not be an epistemic reason. So in such cases, he says, a person may come to count on P in the sense of staking something on P while dismissing the possibility that not P. And that's his gloss on what it means to hold a belief. Okay, so that's what Genet is saying in response to that second interpretation of Williams' argument. And I think that sort of response can be applied also to the sorts of cases that I'm interested in. So Abenas and Ying are both operating under epistemic uncertainty. Based on the evidence, either P or not P might be true in both scenarios. Their epistemic reasons for and against believing that P are balanced. Now, I'm not saying that they're perfectly balanced, right? But they're balanced enough that both options are reasonably open from an epistemic standpoint. On the other hand, they also have significant non-evidential reason for believing P. In this case, the existential reasons that I spoke about before. And so they therefore decide to count on P, behaving as if P is true, and dismissing, at least provisionally, the contrary possibility. And so I say, psychologically, it's plausible that Abenas and Ying come to believe that P, and furthermore, as a bonus, if you like, it's also not irrational for them to do so. Because it's not just that they desire to be a particular type of person. Now, notice that the Genet case that we talked about earlier is really just a case where someone prefers to believe, it's convenient to believe that you locked the door. But in this case, there's a bit more than that going on, because it's not just that Abenas and Ying desire to be a particular type of person. They also think it's good, that is, objectively desirable, to be a person of that kind. And it's this, what they take to be an objective reason that motivates them to adopt the beliefs that such a person would hold. All right, so that's what I have to say about Williams' first argument. I'll move on to his second argument. So again, here's how he sets it out. And this is, I think, even a bit more obscure than the first argument. So he says, a very central idea with regard to empirical belief is that of coming to believe that P, because it is so. That is, the relation between a person's perceptual environment, their perceptions, and the beliefs that result. Unless a concept satisfies the demands of that notion, namely that we can understand the idea that they come to believe that P, because it is so, And because their perceptual organs are working, it will not be the concept of empirical belief. But a state that could be produced at will would not satisfy these demands because there would be no regular connection between the environment, the perceptions, and what the person came out with. Okay, so that's a bit tricky. So what is he saying there? Well, as best I can tell, the idea seems to be that if a person's putative belief is not related to their reliable perceptions of their environment, then it doesn't aim at truth, as Williams puts it. And so he seems to be suggesting that we can't come to genuinely believe something unless this is based solely, perhaps, or at least partially, on perceptual evidence. But this seems not to be right. So there seem to be clear cases where a person forms a belief based on factors other than direct perceptual evidence. And so Jonathan Bennett is one person who discusses this, and he cites the example of beliefs induced by hypnotism. So it seems like if you're under hypnotism and you're induced to hold a particular belief, you generally hold that belief, even though it's not based on your perceptual evidence. Now, here's another type of case which I think may get at the same sort of point. So I'm calling this case distant sheep. And in this case, I see an animal in the far distance, which appears to be either a horse or a sheep. And in fact, as far as I can tell from a long way away, it looks a bit more like a horse than a sheep to me. But I also know that there are a lot of sheep in that general area, although there are also some horses. And so after reflection, I come to believe the animal is a sheep. And this is despite my perceptual organs working properly, and if anything, indicating the contrary. So this seems to be a case where I genuinely form a belief, but the belief is not based on a direct connection to perceptual evidence gained through my sense organs in the way that Williams appears to be talking about. It's a belief I form for an epistemic reason, but it's not an epistemic reason related to my perceptions in that sort of direct way. And so this seems to undermine what Williams is contending, at least if we've interpreted him correctly. So how does this apply to the two cases that I have proposed? So Abenash and Ying are not indifferent to the perceptual evidence, but their perceptions do not, and perhaps cannot, tell them what to believe on the question that's before them. And so, as we saw, they form their beliefs based on other types of considerations. And if it's possible, as I think is pretty clearly the case, that we can form beliefs based on factors other than direct and immediate perception, as the distant sheep case shows, then this process at least seems to be coherent. Now, the difference is that the belief in the distant sheep case is based on a kind of evidence, albeit not direct perceptual evidence, and Abenash and Ying's beliefs are not based on evidence, but on existential reasons. But this brings us back to the argument I made earlier in response to Williams' first objection. So I've already argued that people can form beliefs based on non-epistemic considerations under certain conditions. And so if that's the case, it's not clear what more Williams' second argument adds to his first one, if that's what we're taking to be getting at. Okay. So let's move on to the third argument against DDV, and this is the argument from William Alston. So Alston starts out his argument against DDV by posing a scenario. He imagines that somebody is offered a huge sum of money. So suppose you're offered $50 million if you can just make yourself believe something that is clearly false. And so that's a huge inducement to form this belief. Alston is asking, could you do it? He says, no, you couldn't do it. Even if you're offered $50 million, you just can't make yourself believe something that you know is patently false. But I think we can grant that point for the purposes of the current argument. So we can grant that a person can't make themselves believe something when they know the evidence is clearly against it, because the types of cases I'm talking about are not that type of case. They're cases where the evidence is equivocal. But Alston also doubts that we can voluntarily form beliefs where the evidence is equivocal. And here's what he says about that. He says, how could I simply choose to believe one rather than another when they seem exactly on a par with respect to the likelihood of truth, especially when that subjective probability is rather low. To do so would be to choose a belief in the face of the lack of any significant inclination to suppose it to be true. It seems clear to me that this is not within our power. So one way of understanding this is that he's questioning what would be our motivation for forming a belief in that circumstance when the evidence is equivocal. So here's how I want to respond to that. And I think it's useful to begin by looking a little bit about the connection between beliefs and dispositions. So we might say part of what it means for a person to believe that P is that they are disposed to treat P as true in a range of like situations. And so if I tell someone that my office door is closed, it would not make sense for me to attempt to walk through the doorway shortly afterwards without first opening the door. That would tend to indicate, but I don't really believe what I asserted, because if I did believe it, I would be disposed to treat it as true in that sort of scenario. So that's the idea. However, if what I'm saying in this paper is correct, then there are some cases where this kind of disposition can be acquired voluntarily. And Alston doubts this because he says it involves forming a belief while lacking any significant inclination to suppose it to be true. But if we look at the cases of Abernash and Ying, their beliefs don't come out of nowhere. By choosing to believe that P, they acquire a disposition to treat P as true in similar situations, but they already had dispositions to treat P as true, because treating P as true is consistent with the type of people they wish to be. So it's not true that Abernash and Ying choose to believe that P in the face of the lack of any significant inclination to suppose it to be true. So they have that significant inclination, and it comes from the existential reason that they have. It comes from their desire, their objectively grounded desire, they think, to be the type of person who would hold that belief. So that, it seems, serves as a response to Alston's argument. Okay. So at this point, I'm going to wrap up the paper, and I'll do that by considering two what I think are interesting philosophical applications of the idea of existential reasons for belief, if we accept that what I've been arguing in the paper so far is correct. So the first application is to legal obligations, and the second one is to beliefs about God. So the question about legal obligation that I'm looking at here is there a generic, that is content-independent, obligation to obey the positive law? And this is a highly contested topic in philosophy of law. There's heated philosophical disagreement on this question. So one view on this issue is the view of Mark Murphy. So Mark Murphy concludes that he goes through the arguments for and against the generic obligation to obey the law, and he concludes there is no generic obligation to obey the law. So the arguments against that sort of obligation put by people like Joseph Raz, he thinks are persuasive. But Mark thinks that this is unfortunate because he thinks it would be better if we did have a generic obligation to obey the law. So what he suggests is that people should voluntarily adopt such an obligation. Okay, we don't in fact have a generic obligation to obey the law, so we should voluntarily bind ourselves to such an obligation, and society would be a better place, he argues, if everybody did that. So we have a reason to do it related to the common good. That's his argument. Now I'll come back to that a bit later on, but what I want to suggest is that there's an alternative strategy available to what Murphy is suggesting there, which is perhaps more psychologically plausible. So imagine somebody who wants to know whether they have a generic obligation to obey the law or not. And so they read all the philosophical texts, and they read the strong arguments made for and against this by various people, and they conclude that the evidence for and against such an obligation is equivocal. It's pretty much evenly poised. So such a person, I think, might reason as follows. I have read good arguments for and against the obligation to obey the law. Prominent philosophers take different sides, and so to someone of my limited philosophical abilities, the arguments seem evenly balanced. and I could investigate further and study the matter for a longer time, but I don't have any reason to believe this would resolve things definitively for me. Now, on the other hand, many people I respect act as if they have an obligation to obey the law. These are responsible, community-minded people who want to do their part for society by following the shared rules which the legal officials have laid down. And I would like to be that type of person. So therefore, I choose to believe that I have a generic obligation to obey the law. So now, if the argument I've been putting in this paper is correct, then I think this is both psychologically plausible and potentially a rational decision to make. And the usefulness of that proposition for contemporary legal philosophy is in part that this might offer a more psychologically plausible alternative to what Murphy is proposing. So one of the possible problems with Murphy's proposal, which he discusses and dismisses, is that there's something a bit odd about the mindset of somebody who, on the one hand, knows they don't have any general obligation to obey the law, but then decides to voluntarily adopt such an obligation. So what would it mean to voluntarily adopt a generic obligation to obey the law? What would prevent you then from departing from that obligation in particular cases, which is essentially what you would do anyway if there wasn't any generic obligation in the first place? So there's something a bit strange about that state of mind, and Murphy concedes that, but he thinks it's not fatal to his proposal. So I think it might in fact be the case that this scenario that I've sketched out is psychologically more plausible than what Murphy is contending for. So it gives a possible alternative route for people to end up with a generic obligation to obey the law, if indeed it serves the common good for people to have that sort of belief, which is what Murphy is contending. Okay. So that's the case of legal obligations. So just to conclude then, I also think we can apply the sort of idea I've been discussing to beliefs about God. So does God exist? One of the perennial and deep questions in philosophy, and plausibly it's a question that can't be resolved by weighing the evidence. So if we assume that's the case, well, given the inconclusive character of evidence for and against God's existence, some people have argued that it's irrational to believe in God. Why? Well, because it's irrational to believe anything, the view goes, unless you have evidence in favour of it that outweighs the evidence against it. But I've been arguing in this paper that it can be not only psychologically plausible, but rational to form a belief in a proposition based on non-evidential reasons when the evidence is equivocal. And so if that's the case, a person might coherently reason like this. So they might say, I've considered the arguments for and against God's existence, and there are certainly some weighty arguments on both sides of this issue. However, the evidence strikes me as evenly poised. And furthermore, it just doesn't seem like the type of thing that can be empirically proved or disproved. However, many people I respect believe that God exists. The people I have in mind are serene, optimistic, and compassionate people. They believe that God has a beneficial design for the world and intends us to love one another. And I would like to be a person like that. Therefore, I choose to believe in a wise and loving God. And again, if what I've been arguing in the paper is true, then I think that sort of reasoning is not only psychologically plausible, but potentially a rational thing to decide. So I put some references on the end of the presentation, but that concludes the argument, and I really look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much. I just need